I'm Stephen Foskett, and this is the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast. Today we're in Boston, Massachusetts for Tech Field Day number 14, and one of the things that came up, well, it was kind of an interesting question that was relevant to some of the people in the room. So I'm actually going to hand it over to Michael Stancliffe to ask the question, and then those of us over here can, hopefully provide a little bit of answers. So what was it that we were talking about a few minutes ago, Michael?
We were talking about how cloud and managed services in the 90s to now, how big of how bad things were in the 90s, basically. So I guess my first question would be, did you know what you were selling at the time wasn't going to work?
Wow, he's just coming right at us.
We actually made it all up is what happened, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty much what it came down to, right? There was a lot of stuff that we thought we could make work. Things like today, Chef, Puppet, automation, didn't exist back then. Mm-hmm. We were just pretty much making it all up. That's not about.
Yeah, we had to use expect.
Yeah. Bash.
Yep.
Right? A lot of bash.
Yeah, a lot of shell scripting.
Yep.
Yeah. So it turns out that we actually worked together at Storage Networks.
We did.
And so what you're getting at there was around 1999, somebody came up with this idea that you could have like a basically storage in a data center remote from the data center that the compute lives in.
What?
And it seemed like a good idea, but we figured out that the networking guys had it covered, but it turns out that these guys who are the networking guys, well, maybe they didn't.
That's why
he's going to blame me.
Right.
Exactly, it's all your fault.
It's those telcos.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, how did you guys react when you heard about this idea that you would have basically metro fiber with managed services?
Well, so there's still a lot of baggage from 1999 because it was a huge telecom bubble, and to people's estimation, there was none of this stuff ever got built. I mean, it all just went quiet. But at the time, in 1999, I think there were a few select cities where you had fiber, you had reasonable connectivity, and then in the preponderance of the locations in the world were dark, right? You got internet connectivity from your phone line. Mm-hmm. So that was 1999, and if you wanted private connectivity, you had basically conglomerations of telephone lines. You'll remember this, right?
ISDN.
Yeah. So you had ISDN, you had fractional T1, and then you had T1, and then T3. I mean, it was basically telephone lines.
And I don't think people today, they throw around words like T1 and T3, but I don't think they understand exactly what that was. That was telephone.
Yeah,
that was
a bundle of phone lines. Yeah. That's what that was.
So a T1 line will be made up of 24 channels, which you would get a fraction of, and you could literally buy any number of pairs for a fraction of the cost of a full T1, and that's where kind of frac T1 came from.
And that's where all the bandwidth numbers came from too.
Yep.
I think people wonder, why 1.54? Where did this number come from?
So back then, it was the big telcos, like you said, where today we're dealing with kind of the cable ISPs in a sense. But no, back then it all rode over the little copper pair phone lines. And even to an extent, the long haul lines still do today, the ones that haven't moved to fiber, at least from a metro perspective. But yeah, back then it was, you still had to punch down at the DMARC, you still had to do all that stuff that you do with phone lines, but now you just screw a coax cable in or a 10 gig Ethernet line in and you're done.
Yeah, and what you mentioned there too is important, and so I was in Houston for the beginning of Storage Networks. That's where I was hired, and that's what I was working on. And the reason Storage Networks worked in Houston, back to did we know it wasn't going to work? Well, we knew it was going to work, but we knew it was only going to work in Houston. And the reason was because in Houston there was this cable TV provider called Phonoscope, and they ran fiber all over the city. And their idea was basically, instead of using coax, they were going to be a cable TV company that would go over fiber. And because of the unique nature of Houston, which is no zoning and you can dig up anything anywhere you want, they ran fiber all over the city. And so we literally located Storage Networks in the Phonoscope building, which was in a horrible part of the town, so that we could leverage all that fiber. But we kind of knew at the time, we better hope that there's more fiber like this in some other city, because it's not going to work without it.
Yep.
And
a lot of that had to do with, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
A lot of that had to do with the way, there's two main reasons that I go back that I constantly remember in my memory banks of why we were doing those certain things from an infrastructure perspective. One of them was to green screen back to a mainframe that was in a central location from remote offices and remote workers and things like that, which today we would refer to as something like VDI or something along those lines, right?
That sounds like the cloud.
Because 2017 is going to be the year of VDI, right?
Yeah.
The other one was, which I kind of equate weirdly to social media. You know, a lot of corporations today, they know they need a Twitter account, but they don't know exactly why they need it. Well, back in like Y2K, everybody needed a website. They didn't really know they needed a website, but and to me, they didn't know why they needed it, but they knew they needed to have one. So these kind of managed hosting sort of places started to spring up to, we'll build your website for you kind of thing. And that was really all that they were used for in that sense.
Yeah, and then you had this idea of time-sharing equipment, right? You know, that's really what this all kind of came down to, right? You know, IBM with the mainframe, you know, had this concept, and that worked pretty well for a lot of areas. And then companies like Storage Network, Storeway, Storability, and 10 million other service providers all said, I'll take that and do it with Open Compute and Windows and, you know,
Yeah,
VMware.
but there was,
Of course, when you
there
say
was no
open
multi-tenancy, and so
Well-
you'd set up a Symmetrix
Right,
for
that's right.
me, you
That's
know,
right.
and so
And
it's
a bunch
all
of
mine,
servers.
and you'd rent it back to me. So there's no service provider economics there. I mean, in terms of multi-tenancy, you're just basically giving me all that unused capacity, and I just rent it from you.
That's
So
what we thought about. I didn't say it actually worked. Right? You know, that's back to his question, why it failed, right? You know.
Well, even the universities like Rutgers and places like that were running the 970 mainframes and time sharing them out for research and stuff like that. So I mean, you know, mid to late 90s, that was kind of
well, you could do that with a mainframe.
Yeah.
It turns out, but you can't do it with storage, or you couldn't.
Well, you could.
Well, you
and-
couldn't until they broke out the RS6000s and started putting them locally and
Yeah.
you know, stuff like that.
Right. And then you had companies like, you know, the more modern companies said, well, we're actually going to build this thing called multi-tenancy and actually put it in there. And right about then, the whole .bomb era happened. And all these companies who, you know, like petfood.com, I don't know if you remember them, right? You know,
Pets.com.
Yeah.
Pets.com, right? You know, it was
Excite.
So I lived the other side of that, right? Because behind every gold rush is a guy that's selling shovels and picks.
Yeah.
And we were making a ton of money selling essentially the switches and routers that were basically being used by all, Pets.com and everybody else. And there was this secondary bust from telecom. So the telecom vendors all had over-leveraged themselves. They just fell apart, and then they stopped buying stuff. And then there were the telecom equipment vendors that suddenly had lost all their customers, and the whole thing just disappeared. And so the only one survived is Cisco. And Cisco, and there was only Cisco.
Juniper.
I think well, Juniper did survive. Actually, that's true.
But they were in a different market. I mean, they never really got.
Checkpoint, I would say, is another survivor of that era.
HP survived, right? HP survived. But all the managed service providers had the same problem, right?
But why did they survive though? Because they bought Compaq. Compaq was the market share leader in servers at the time.
That's right.
So I think that's the only way they really survived through that was they bought the white pizza box servers.
That's right.
So what really went wrong then? That's, I guess, the question. So we talked about bandwidth, but I think where you're getting at here with the whole time sharing thing, which is now called multi-tenancy.
Or the cloud.
It was multi-tenancy that was a big problem.
Yeah.
I mean, because originally the plan was to share Symmetrix. But then it didn't work because of the fact that Symmetrix wasn't engineered to be shared. And so basically, I raised my hand at the time, and you were on the other end of that discussion.
Two of us.
And we were saying, basically, wait a second, you can't share a Symmetrix because anyone can have access to anyone's data.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so we tried every other storage vendor out there, and lo and behold, they all had the same problem.
Yeah.
Right. Because
so there was really no in-box firewall possible.
No, and so we were actually making money, or we were getting money. I don't know how much money we were actually making at that point in time, right? But then when all of our customers, about a third of them disappeared in the .bomb era. This is that secondary effect you were talking about earlier, right? It just vanished. We didn't have enough runway to get to the point where now there is true multi-tenancy, and there's things like encryption and security and dedupe and compression, and all of those technologies make things economically viable in the cloud and other things.
Yeah, but I think you guys actually, there's another point that you guys miss, and that is people's own predispositions. The big problem. So your customers at Storage Networks were predominantly the .coms, and they had a different way of thinking about things. And today, even today, we run into enterprise customers that are very, very reticent to let things go outside their four walls. You see that all the time. But by and large, it's a mainstream idea that, yeah, I can put my data outside of my firewall. I can run these things outside of my, in 1999, you had, I believe, this sort of glass ceiling above that market that you could never get through, because the mass market would never approve of outsourcing these types of services. I think you don't have that by and large today. And that's happened over a period of 10 years, and it's happened because cloud providers are available, and the economics of the cloud made it easy for a low-end market to form there.
So what kind of, well, first of all, I'd ask, to piggyback on the, how did you know it wasn't going to work? I guess what did work? What were some success stories that you had as a result of some of the things you were doing at the time?
So that question kind of ties back to what you were saying about not being able to secure a storage system, and I would say that was one of the things that led us to the siloed client-server era of the 2000s before we had virtualization.
Yeah.
You had a server, you had an application, let's say Microsoft Exchange, and it had its own servers, its own storage, its own backup software, its own stuff, and it lived in that, and it had a team of guys or girls that managed that stack. And it was extremely siloed, and it was very specialized, and you had Clarions, you had the Symmetrixes, you had all of that stuff, right? And I think it's funny how things come full circle now, where we went from managed hosting to siloed to virtualization. Now we're back to cloud, and something like ClearSky is a great example of this kind of metro architecture in a sense, where everything is kind of shared, but it's all controlled centrally like that. So it's funny to me how the wheel just continues to churn, and we go through these phases of IT, but are we going to get to a point again where the metro stuff doesn't work, and we're going to get so fearful and paranoid, I guess is the word I want to use, that we go back to these siloed kind of secure architectures?
Well, there's a lot of worry about things like hacking and people breaking into networks and ransomware and all those kind of things. If that continues to progress, that might lead to people saying, you know what, those four walls, I can put a person around that and guard my data. So it may happen to go back that way. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of trends that could lead towards that, but that certainly could happen.
Yeah. And of course, then there's also the mega trend that we're seeing, here in 2017, which is the nationalization or nationalism trend, and that was a problem in 1999, and it remains a problem today. So I guess that's not an answer to what worked. That's an answer maybe to what we learned that isn't going to work and didn't work. Is you can't bust through national walls and national borders because of laws and data protection and things like that.
Well, there will always be a data sovereignty problem because different people view their privacy in different ways.
Yeah.
This millennial guy over here, I'm sure he'll post everything about himself on like Snapchat, right? I mean,
Well, Laz, I love that you brought that up in your presentation, because that was something that global larger companies deal with, different customers in the data sovereignty, and some European countries just innately gives the government rights to see to all that data regardless, right? Yeah. And that is a big problem that would lead back to a siloing thing where companies maybe doesn't want to host their stuff in the cloud, and it'll influence decisions about how that stuff gets spread around the world.
It's really funny. Germany, I didn't realize this until I was speaking to a German carrier. The Azure cloud is run by a German telco. Yeah. And it has to be that way, otherwise no one will trust it.
Well, and you just had China pass a law that all encryption keys, same with Russia as well, that anything encrypted, the government has to have a copy of the encryption keys, right? So anything anywhere in the country. So you start having something like that, all of a sudden a company's going to go, wait a minute here. Right? Those four walls, I can keep it within the four walls. At least I know who has access to it.
So we've identified something that didn't work then and won't work now.
Yep.
What in answer to his question, what did work?
It's a people problem.
It's a people problem.
Well,
right?
yeah, and what other lessons you learned in the 90s do you carry forward to now? You're talking about watching the circle of life of sort of moving from terminals and then now VDIs.
I think the idea of mainframes and shared resources, it's back. It came back
Never
with
left.
virtualization in a big way. But then we got into the micro of managing resources, discrete resources across those things, and that made us scale out more instead of scaling up in like a big mainframe would.
Yeah.
So I think we've gotten back to that point, but we're starting to stretch out again where things scale. So that's something I would say that we kind of learned to do well with using mainframes in the late 90s. Was virtualization kind of came from that.
Something else that actually was really interesting and is still true today is about disaster recovery, right? The concepts of disaster recovery are more or less the same as what they were. It's tell me what you're trying to protect against, right? And then you start developing a plan towards that. But when you talk to customers today, even people that have been around for quite a while, there's still a very high reticence to implement it because of the cost. That hasn't changed, but what we have learned is that the methodologies are pretty solid, right? So the way to protect your disaster, the way to protect your data against disaster, that worked pretty well.
Well, there are different approaches to it. So the cloudies will tell you that that the legacy systems, although they're disaster tolerant, they're brittle, and you're not thinking about things the right way. And so some of the methodologies are not the same. And but I failed sometimes to see that they're that different from one another. But
hold on a second. It's still make multiple copies, geographically disperse
Yes,
them,
put
put
them
them somewhere else.
Exactly.
It's the exact same thing. There's no difference. The difference is, I call it different availability zones and different. It's the same damn thing.
Well,
put it physically somewhere else.
I would say that the orchestration of a DR plan has changed
That's the
dramatically, but the fundamentals of what makes up DR are kind of the same. I used to get paid a lot of money to build a Note 3-ring binder of a run book, and I used to jokingly call it the admin gets hit by a bus book.
Yeah.
And here it is, step by step, literally of commands to execute and where the data is going to be and all that stuff. Well, now we have something like SRM for VMware, or a solution like you guys are doing that's kind of an Edge Metro solution, leveraging the cloud. I mean, stuff like that. I think the orchestration has changed, but the underlying fundamentals of multiple copies, offline data, all that stuff, it remains the same. Yeah.
And I guess to wrap up in terms of what I learned from that work and trying to architect the disaster recovery systems was that you can't have it be an occasional thing. It has to be kind of like it has to be constantly exercised, and it has to be constantly on, because we had huge issues with incompatibilities of drivers and systems, and the joke back then was basically, yeah, that's nice, we can come up with a DR plan, but step one is going to be I quit, because there's no way any of it's going to work. I mean, we all knew that it wasn't going to work, and because it just was not possible to work, because step one was buy a lot of servers.
Yeah.
And they have to be exactly identical to the ones we used to have in every possible way, right down to the firmware revisions. And then we have to do everything else, right? And I think that's one reason that we all went crazy for virtualization, because it made a standard hardware base. And so step one, instead of buy a bunch of identical servers, it was basically spin up something that can run these virtual identical servers. And that actually made DR possible where it was never possible before. And it's the same, now with cloud computing. I think we're kind of learning the second lesson, which is, like I said, you can't have DR be something you never actually do. It has to be something that's always exercised. And so I think that, today's outages and so on, the only way to deal with them is to have systems that are continually up and running. You have to have dual home systems. You have to use, multiple regions of AWS or something like that, because otherwise you can't wait until it fails before you start moving it over somewhere else. It has to be running in two places in order for it to be successful.
Not 100%, not necessarily. So I think to the point of exercising the muscle, if you're under SOX compliance or healthcare or any kind of public company, you're going to have to exercise that muscle. There's going to be auditors that show up a couple times a year to make sure you're exercising that muscle successfully. But one of the funny things that I remember about tape specifically is one of the big healthcare companies that I worked for, we used to store a tape drive, even going back to a big parallel interface or a SCSI interface with 10-year-old, 12-year-old tapes, because we were always concerned that we wouldn't be able to find one of those old DLT tape drives if we needed to restore some really old data for some reason, and we'd have to go pull it out, plug it into an old-ass server, and put a tape in it and make sure that we could get that data out. I mean,
and that's when we learned that we have to keep things fresh and alive.
But you also learned that tape degrades. That was an interesting thing over time that a lot of people don't realize. Hey, I've been backing up for 10 or 15 years of tape. Well, if you haven't tried to restore that tape's been sitting in Iron Mountain for 10 years. A third of it's probably gone.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to just do those things regularly.
Yep. Well, we got to wrap it up, because that's about as long as we've got for this podcast. Thank you guys for joining me here on premises for the on-premise IT Roundtable podcast.
It's a fun trip down memory lane.
Fun trip down memory lane, exactly. We were back in the old premises.
Yeah, we were.
Premises.
So we will be back next Tuesday with another episode of the on-premise IT Roundtable. Check us out on YouTube in Gestalt IT. Otherwise, go to gestaltit.com/podcast or search for the On-Premise IT Roundtable in your favorite podcast application.